What if the reason your life hasn't changed yet is not because your dream is too big, but because you're trying to change everything at once? Think about it. Millions of people want a better life, more success, more freedom, more stability. Yet most of them never begin the journey at all. Not because they lack ambition, but because the distance feels overwhelming. Tonight's story begins with a man who felt exactly that way. Poor, exhausted, and convinced that the life he wanted was far beyond his reach. Every year looked the same as the last, and the future felt like a mountain too high to climb. But one quiet decision changed everything. Not a dramatic leap, not a lucky opportunity, just one small step forward, repeated every single day. What happened next would slowly transform his entire life. And by the end of this story, you might realize something surprising. The same principle that changed his future could quietly start changing yours, starting tomorrow. So stay with me, because the smallest step you take today might be the beginning of a life you once thought was impossible. Most people carry quiet dreams inside them. A better life, more freedom, a future that feels bigger than today. Yet every morning, reality taps them on the shoulder. Bills to pay, responsibilities piling up, routines that never seem to change, and slowly, those dreams start to feel like something meant for someone else. It's not that people don't want to change. Actually, deep down, many of them desperately do. They imagine becoming healthier, more successful, more fulfilled. But when they look at the distance between their current life and that vision, well, it feels like staring up at a mountain that touches the clouds. So what happens next is painfully common. The dream feels too big, the climb too steep, and instead of taking the first step, people freeze. They wait for the perfect moment, the perfect plan, the perfect burst of motivation. But that moment rarely arrives. Days quietly turn into months. Months drift into years before anyone really notices. The dream is still there somewhere, buried under routine and responsibility. But the gap between life as it is and life as it could be feels wider than ever, almost like it's growing on its own. Here's the strange paradox. The bigger the dream, the more intimidating it becomes. And the more intimidating it becomes, the less likely someone is to begin. It's a trap many people fall into without realizing it. A dream so large, it silently stops them from moving at all. You've probably seen it before. Someone wants to change their financial life, but the numbers overwhelm them. Someone wants to get healthy, yet the journey seems endless. Someone wants to learn new skills, but the starting point feels too far behind. So they tell themselves, maybe someday. But someday is a tricky word. It sounds hopeful on the surface, yet most of the time it quietly pushes action further into the future. And the longer someone waits, the heavier that mountain begins to look, until even the idea of climbing it feels exhausting. And that's where many stories would simply end. A dream too big, a life too small, and a future left unexplored. But every once in a while, someone appears whose story doesn't follow that pattern. Someone who starts from the very bottom, without realizing he's about to discover something most people never see. And strangely enough, his journey doesn't begin with a giant leap. It begins with a life that looks almost completely hopeless. The man at the center of this story didn't look like someone destined for a great transformation. If you had passed him on the street, you probably wouldn't have noticed anything unusual. Just another tired face moving through a crowded day. But behind those quiet eyes lived a weight most people couldn't see. A life that felt like it had been stuck in the same place for far too long. He lived in a small, worn-down apartment on the edge of the city. The kind of place where the paint slowly peels from the walls and the windows rattle when trucks pass outside. Every morning began the same way. An early alarm, a rushed breakfast, and a long walk to work. Not because he loved the job, but because survival didn't leave him many options. For him, work wasn't about dreams. It was simply about getting through another day. Money was always tight, sometimes painfully tight. There were weeks when every coin had to be counted before buying even the simplest things. A broken appliance, an unexpected bill, a small emergency. Any of those could shake his fragile stability, and that constant pressure quietly followed him everywhere he went. Yet the hardest part wasn't the money. It was the feeling that life was moving forward, just without him. Friends seemed to be building careers, families, opportunities. Meanwhile, his own days felt like they were running on a loop. Wake up, work, come home exhausted, repeat. Sometimes at night, when the city outside finally quieted down, he would sit alone with his thoughts. In those moments, a different version of his life would appear in his mind, a version where things worked out, where he had stability, confidence, maybe even success. But those thoughts often faded as quickly as they came, because reality always returned, and reality reminded him of something painful. Dreaming about a different life was easy. Believing it could actually happen to someone like him, that was a much harder thing to hold on to. Still, somewhere deep inside, a tiny spark refused to die, a quiet voice that occasionally whispered that life might hold more than this. He didn't know how things could ever change. He didn't even know where to begin, but the thought kept appearing, especially on his most difficult days. And soon that quiet hope would collide with a truth he could no longer ignore. Because the routine he had been living for years was about to reveal just how deeply stuck he really was. At first glance, his life didn't look dramatic. There were no sudden disasters, no headline-worthy struggles, just the slow, quiet repetition of ordinary days. But sometimes the hardest battles aren't loud at all. Sometimes they're hidden inside routines that never seem to change. Every morning followed the same pattern. The alarm rang. He rubbed the sleep from his eyes, and the day began before he was ready. The walk to work felt longer than it really was, his mind already heavy with the hours ahead. He worked hard, often harder than most people around him, yet the effort rarely seemed to lead anywhere new. Evenings felt strangely empty. He returned home exhausted, his body tired, but his mind restless. Dinner was simple, sometimes rushed, sometimes skipped altogether. Then came the quiet hours. Television playing in the background, thoughts wandering in circles. Another day had passed, yet nothing meaningful seemed to have moved forward. And slowly, a dangerous thought began to grow. Maybe this was just how life worked. Maybe some people were simply meant to struggle while others moved ahead. It wasn't a thought he liked, but it appeared more often than he wanted to admit. And the more it appeared, the heavier his days began to feel. What made it worse was the constant comparison. Scrolling through social media, seeing former classmates building careers, traveling, celebrating milestones. Everyone seemed to be going somewhere, everyone except him, and that silent comparison quietly drained his confidence. Sometimes he tried to change things. He would promise himself that tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow he would learn something new, save more money, build a better plan. But after a long day of work and fatigue, those promises often dissolved. The next morning arrived, and the cycle quietly restarted. That's the tricky part about feeling stuck. It rarely happens all at once. It creeps in slowly, disguising itself as routine, responsibility, survival. Until one day, a person realizes something unsettling. Years may have passed, without real progress, and deep down, he could feel that truth beginning to surface. Something inside him was starting to question everything. The routine, the excuses, the endless waiting. Because sooner or later, every person facing this kind of life reaches a moment where they can no longer ignore the reality in front of them. And for him, that moment was closer than he realized. One evening, something felt different, not because anything dramatic had happened that day. Work had been the same, the walk home the same. Even the quiet apartment looked exactly as it always did. Yet as he sat down in the dim light of the room, a strange thought refused to leave his mind. A question he had avoided for years was suddenly impossible to ignore. He looked around his small apartment slowly. The worn furniture, the stack of unpaid bills on the table, the tired reflection staring back from the dark window. For the first time, he wasn't just seeing his life. He was measuring it, not against other people, but against time itself. And that realization landed like a heavy stone in his chest. Years had passed. Not weeks, not months, but years. Years of effort, exhaustion, routine. Yet somehow the destination still looked exactly the same as the starting point. It was a painful thought, the kind most people quickly push away. But that night, he didn't push it away. He let the truth sit there beside him in the silence. If nothing changed, if every day continued exactly like this, where would he be 5 years from now? 10 years from now? The answer wasn't dramatic. It was worse than that. It was predictable. Another small apartment, another routine job, another decade quietly slipping past. And that quiet prediction suddenly terrified him. Something inside him shifted in that moment. Not anger, not frustration, something deeper. It was the realization that waiting had become its own prison. He had been hoping life would change someday, but someday had been passing him by for years. He stood up and began pacing the room slowly. His thoughts moved faster than his feet. If his life looked the same year after year, maybe the problem wasn't the world. Maybe the problem was the way he had been approaching it, and that realization cracked something open in his mind. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about survival. He was thinking about possibility. But possibility can be dangerous if it stays only in the mind. Sooner or later, a person has to decide whether they're willing to act on it. And that night, standing in that quiet apartment, he made a decision, not a loud one, not the kind people announce to the world, just a small, quiet decision that would slowly begin to change everything. The decision he made that night didn't feel heroic. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic promises shouted into the universe. In fact, it was almost disappointingly simple. Standing alone in that quiet apartment, he realized something most people overlook. Maybe the problem wasn't the size of his dream, but the way he was trying to reach it. For years, he had looked at his future like a giant mountain. Success, stability, a better life, all of it seemed impossibly far away. And every time he imagined climbing that mountain in one huge leap, he froze. The distance felt overwhelming before he even began. So instead of climbing, he had stayed exactly where he was. But that night, a different thought appeared. What if he didn't have to climb the entire mountain at once? What if the only thing he needed to focus on was the next step? Not 10 years ahead, not even next year, just tomorrow. It was such a small idea that it almost felt silly at first. How could one small step possibly change a life that felt this stuck? But then he realized something quietly powerful. Doing nothing had already been his strategy for years, and that clearly wasn't working. So he made a rule for himself, a simple one. Every single day, he would do one thing that moved his life forward. It didn't have to be impressive. It just had to be real. Maybe it would be learning a new skill for 30 minutes. Maybe reading a few pages of a book about something useful. Maybe saving a small amount of money instead of spending it. Tiny actions most people would barely notice, but actions that pointed his life in a new direction. At first, the idea felt almost fragile, like a small flame that could easily go out. He knew motivation wouldn't always be there. He knew some days would be harder than others. But the rule was simple enough to survive even on difficult days. One step forward, every day. And strangely enough, that tiny commitment began to change the way he looked at tomorrow. Because the moment someone decides to move, even slowly, something shifts inside them. They stop waiting for life to change and start becoming the reason it does. But he still didn't know something important. A principle that would soon make his small decision far more powerful than he imagined. A principle he would discover in a place he never expected. Many of the stories you hear here aren't just stories. They reflect the invisible weight you may be carrying every day. If you're tired of holding pain, responsibility, and guilt that were never yours, I created an ebook called The Weight of Stones That Are Not Yours and More Too Bonus for you. It's for those who want to let go, set boundaries, and live with more lightness. The link is in the description and in the pinned comment. A few days after that quiet decision, life continued much as it always had. The same early alarm, the same long walk to work, the same tired streets he passed every morning. But something inside him had shifted. Now, instead of moving through the day on autopilot, he was paying attention, almost as if he were searching for something he couldn't quite name yet. One afternoon during his lunch break, he wandered into a small second-hand bookstore near his job. It wasn't a place he usually visited. Dusty shelves, old paperbacks, stacked unevenly, the faint smell of aging pages in the air. He wasn't even looking for anything specific. But sometimes the most important discoveries happen when you're not actively searching. As he browsed the shelves, one thin book caught his attention. The cover was simple, almost forgotten among the others. Curious, he picked it up and flipped through the pages. Inside was a short story about a man who had transformed his life in an unexpected way. Not through luck, not through sudden success, but through something surprisingly small. The story explained a simple principle. Massive change rarely happens all at once. Instead, it grows quietly, almost invisibly at first. Tiny improvements repeated every day begin to stack on top of each other, until one day, the results become impossible to ignore. The idea struck him harder than he expected, because it mirrored the small decision he had already begun to make. But the book explained something he hadn't fully understood yet. Those tiny steps he was taking weren't meaningless. They were the foundation of something powerful. The author used a simple example. Imagine improving just 1% every day. Not a huge leap, not a dramatic transformation. Just a small improvement that seems almost insignificant in the moment. But repeated day after day, those small gains begin to compound. A skill improves. Confidence grows. Opportunities slowly begin to appear where none existed before. Like drops of water carving a path through stone, progress builds quietly over time. Most people quit before they ever see this effect. He closed the book slowly, staring at the final sentence on the page. For the first time, his small daily rule felt bigger than a simple experiment. It felt like he had accidentally stepped onto a path that others had walked before him. A path built not on sudden breakthroughs, but on something far more reliable. And soon, he would turn that idea into a system for his own life. The idea he discovered that afternoon didn't leave his mind. All the way home, it replayed in quiet loops. Small improvements, repeated every day. At first, it sounded almost too simple to be powerful. But the more he thought about it, the more it began to make sense. That night, he sat at the small table in his apartment with a notebook. Nothing fancy, just a cheap notebook and a pen. But for the first time in years, he wasn't writing down problems. He was designing a system, a simple structure that would guide his days. He wrote one sentence at the top of the page: move forward every day, not in giant leaps, not in ways that would overwhelm him again. Just steady, consistent movement. Then he began listing small actions he could repeat daily. 30 minutes learning a useful skill online, reading a few pages of a book that could expand his thinking, saving even the smallest amount of money when possible. Tiny actions that pointed toward a better future. The rule was clear and non-negotiable. Every day required at least one step forward, even on exhausting days. Even on days when motivation disappeared, because progress, he realized, had to become a habit. Some days the step might be big, other days it might be almost invisible. But what mattered wasn't the size of the action. What mattered was maintaining the direction, forward, no matter how slowly. He even created a small ritual each night. Before going to sleep, he would write down the step he had taken that day. Sometimes it was just a single line, but seeing those lines accumulate began to feel strangely satisfying, like quiet proof that something was changing. And slowly, a new feeling began to replace the old sense of helplessness. It wasn't excitement yet. It wasn't confidence either. It was something quieter, but powerful. Momentum. But momentum, especially at the beginning, is fragile. And very soon he would discover that the first days of real change are often the hardest ones to survive. The first few days of his new system felt strangely exciting, not because his life had changed overnight. It hadn't. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was moving instead of waiting. Each small action gave him a quiet sense of control, like steering a ship that had once been drifting. But excitement rarely lasts forever. Soon enough, reality began to push back. Workdays grew long and exhausting again. Some evenings his body felt heavy, and the couch looked far more inviting than progress. And that's when the whisper of doubt began to return. "Does this even matter?" the voice asked. 30 minutes of learning felt insignificant. Saving a few coins didn't seem like it could build a future. Reading a few pages of a book hardly looked like the path to success. The steps felt so small they were almost invisible. That's the dangerous stage most people never survive. The moment when effort exists, but results haven't appeared yet. The mind starts measuring progress too early. And when the scoreboard looks empty, motivation begins to fade. Many people quietly quit right here. He felt that temptation more than once. There were nights when skipping his daily step would have been easy. After all, missing just one day didn't seem like a big deal. No one else would even notice. But he knew something important was at stake, because habits don't break all at once. They crack slowly. One skipped day becomes two become a week, and before long, the old routine quietly takes control again. So he made a small adjustment to his thinking. Instead of asking, "Will this change my life today?" he began asking a different question. "Am I becoming the kind of person who moves forward?" And that subtle shift changed everything. Now each small step had a deeper meaning. It wasn't just about results anymore. It was about identity. Each action was a vote for the future version of himself, a quiet declaration that his life was no longer standing still. Still, progress was happening in ways he couldn't yet see. Beneath the surface, something was beginning to build. Something that only reveals itself after patience has done its work. And soon, the first signs of that hidden progress would begin to appear. Weeks passed quietly. From the outside, his life still looked almost the same. He still walked the same streets every morning, worked the same job, returned to the same apartment. Anyone watching from a distance would probably say nothing had changed. But beneath the surface, something subtle was unfolding. The daily steps had begun to stack on top of each other. 30 minutes of learning had turned into many hours of new knowledge. A few saved coins had slowly grown into a small but reassuring cushion. Books that once felt difficult were now easier to understand. Without realizing it, he was becoming slightly stronger every week. At first, the progress was almost invisible, like seeds growing underground before breaking through the soil. Most people give up during this stage because they expect immediate results. But he had stopped measuring progress day by day. Now he was watching the direction of his life instead. Small things began to feel different. Conversations at work became easier because he had more ideas to share. Problems that once confused him now had clearer solutions. He started noticing opportunities that he would have ignored before. The world hadn't changed, but the way he moved through it had. Confidence didn't arrive suddenly. It crept in quietly, almost unnoticed. Each small promise he kept to himself strengthened his belief. If he could stay consistent for a week, maybe he could do it for a month. If he could do it for a month, what might a year look like? His evenings began to feel different too. Instead of ending the day drained and defeated, he now ended it with a small victory. Sometimes the victory was tiny, finishing a chapter, practicing a skill, saving a little money. But those tiny wins accumulated into something powerful, a growing sense that his life was finally moving somewhere. The notebook on his table began to fill with entries, line after line of small actions. At first it had looked like a simple experiment. Now it looked more like evidence, proof that consistent effort was quietly reshaping his future. And slowly, another realization began to appear. Progress wasn't just changing his circumstances, it was changing him. The man who once felt trapped was learning something new about himself, something he had doubted for years. He was capable of building momentum. And once momentum starts building, life has a surprising way of responding. Because eventually, consistent effort reaches a point where the world begins to notice. And for him, that moment was getting closer. One afternoon at work, something unusual happened. Not dramatic, not life-shattering, but different enough to catch his attention. A problem had come up that no one seemed eager to solve. Normally, he would have stayed quiet like always. But this time, something inside him pushed gently forward. Over the past few months, he had been learning a new skill during those quiet evening sessions. Nothing glamorous, just something practical he believed might open doors someday. At first, it had felt like throwing pebbles into the ocean, small efforts disappearing into a vast future. But now, standing there in that moment, those small lessons suddenly felt useful. So he spoke up, carefully at first, explaining an idea he had been studying. A few co-workers turned their heads. The supervisor listened, and before he even realized it, he was walking through a solution step by step. The room grew quiet, not awkward quiet, attentive quiet, the kind that happens when people suddenly realize someone has something valuable to say. And when he finished explaining, the supervisor nodded slowly. It wasn't applause or celebration, but it was recognition. Later that day, his supervisor stopped him before he left. Nothing dramatic, just a short conversation near the doorway. He mentioned that the idea had helped solve the issue faster than expected. Then he said something simple that stayed in the man's mind for days. "You've been improving lately." Those words echoed louder than they should have. Because for months, his progress had been invisible. All those quiet nights of learning, saving, and building discipline had happened in silence. And now, for the first time, the outside world had noticed. It wasn't a promotion. It wasn't sudden wealth or overnight success. But it was proof that those tiny daily steps were slowly reshaping reality. The mountain he once feared might actually be climbable. Walking home that evening felt different. The streets hadn't changed. The apartment waiting for him was still small and simple, but something inside him had shifted in a powerful way. The path he had started walking was beginning to respond. And when the first door opens, even just a little, something remarkable happens. New possibilities begin to appear where there were none before. Because momentum has a strange habit of attracting opportunity. And soon, the life he once thought impossible would begin to take shape. That small moment at work didn't change his life overnight, but it changed something even more important: his trajectory. From that day forward, the world seemed to respond differently to him. Not because luck suddenly appeared, but because he had quietly become someone new, someone prepared to recognize opportunity when it arrived. His daily system continued, the notebook still filled with small actions every evening, learning, saving, improving, step by step. But now, those steps felt less uncertain. They were no longer guesses, they were building blocks. Over time, the skill he had been practicing began to stand out. Coworkers started asking him questions. Supervisors trusted him with slightly bigger responsibilities. Nothing glamorous at first, just small chances to prove his growing ability. But each chance strengthened the foundation he had been building. Months turned into years, and the quiet discipline he once struggled to maintain had become second nature. Learning was no longer something he forced himself to do. It had become part of who he was, just another step forward in his daily rhythm. Eventually, a bigger opportunity appeared. A position opened that required the very skills he had been slowly developing. Years earlier, he wouldn't even have considered applying. Back then, the gap between him and that opportunity felt enormous. Now, it felt reachable. He applied, not with the confidence of someone who believed success was guaranteed, but with the calm certainty of someone who had done the work. When the interview came, he didn't rely on luck or charm. He relied on the countless small steps behind him, and those steps spoke loudly. The knowledge he had built, the discipline he had developed, the mindset he had forged. What once looked like ordinary effort had quietly transformed him. The man who once felt powerless was now someone moving steadily upward. Not through shortcuts, through consistency. His life didn't become perfect. No life ever does. But stability arrived where chaos once lived. Opportunities replaced the constant pressure of survival. And the future no longer looked like a wall. It looked like a path. Yet the most powerful part of his transformation wasn't the job, the money, or the opportunities. It was the discovery that had made all of it possible. A discovery so simple that most people overlook it completely. And that discovery holds a lesson for anyone watching his story unfold. When people hear stories like his, they often look for the dramatic moment, the breakthrough, the lucky opportunity, the turning point where everything suddenly changed. But the truth of his journey was far quieter than that. His life didn't transform in a single day. It changed through hundreds of ordinary days that most people would overlook. Days where progress looked small, days where results were invisible, days where discipline mattered more than motivation. That's the part many people misunderstand about success. They imagine giant leaps, sudden wins, dramatic breakthroughs, but most real transformations happen in slow motion, built step by step, choice by choice, so quietly that almost no one notices at first. Think about it for a moment. If someone improves their life just a little each day, what happens after a year? After 5 years? Small actions begin stacking like bricks in a wall, and one day, that wall becomes a completely new reality. The man in this story didn't discover a secret shortcut. He didn't find hidden opportunities reserved for special people. He discovered something much more reliable, the quiet power of daily progress. And here's the surprising part. This principle doesn't belong to him alone. It's available to anyone willing to use it, anyone willing to move forward, even when the steps feel small, anyone willing to be patient with the process. Maybe your step today is reading 10 pages of a book. Maybe it's learning a new skill for half an hour. Maybe it's saving a small amount of money or improving a habit. None of those actions look impressive in isolation, but repeated consistently, they reshape a life. The world often celebrates sudden success. But behind nearly every transformation lies a quiet routine, daily effort, repeated long enough for momentum to take over. That's where real change lives. Not in dramatic moments, in daily choices. And that raises an interesting question. If small steps could change his entire life, what might happen if someone watching this story started doing the same tomorrow? Because the next step forward might be smaller than you think, and it might already be waiting.